Thank you very much, Dora. It was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. And now we are getting to Ekaterina.
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, yes, you are. So Ekaterina, the floor is yours if you are there.
Thank you so much. Can you hear
me? You.
Yes, we can.
Great. So because I'm joining from the research trip and I'm now in the Russian city of Kostroma at the Volga River, where I'm together with the colleagues from the Center of Jewish Art document the synagogues and the cemeteries. So I hope that everything works out well with the internet. My name is Ekaterina Oleshkevich, and my main field of expertise is the history of Jewish childhood in the Russian Empire.
Just excuse me, Ekaterina, we are not seeing you.
It's strange because I'll try to switch off my video and switch it on again. Is it all right now?
Here. I can see her.
We do see her.
Okay, great. Yeah, probably there was some technical error. Yeah, whatever. So just a moment, I'll share my presentation. And as I've mentioned, my main area of expertise is the history of Jewish childhood in the Russian Empire, and I'm writing my PhD on this topic. And I work pretty a lot with the AGO documents, and therefore I'm very happy to participate in this workshop and to discuss the methodological challenges and all the other challenges and opportunities the AGO documents present for the researchers. So as we all know and understand, the main problem, or maybe the main advantage of AGO documents, is their subjectivity. So especially when one talks about the childhood, and it's the autobiography, which was written when the person was aged like 50, 60, 70. Usually people write autobiographies when they are in their elder years rather than in the youth. So we can understand that it creates much space for bias and also for the revelation of the events of childhood in the light of the adult views. And I base my research mostly on the autobiographies written by Jews who spent their childhood in the Russian Empire. And therefore, I found this question really fascinating and challenging for my research, and tried to find an answer to it. And so basically my question is, what influences more the childhood narrative? Whether we can see the actual experience of childhood in this narrative, or it's just the product of the adult beliefs. To answer this question, I've chosen two people with very similar factual conditions of childhood, but very different views and life trajectories as adults, to try to check whether their the childhood narrative is similar or different. And the two people I've chosen are Moshe Leib Lilienblum and Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinovich Teumim, who have like many factual similarities in their the events they experience in the childhood. But although their ideologies is very different, and so basically nothing except the beard unites these people as adults. So what are the similarities? Both of them were born in 1843. We have some difficulties with the date of birth of Autobiographies Haderet, but yeah, we have some sources where it stated that he was born in 1845, but still this difference of 2 years doesn't make much difference. Both of them were born in the Kovna province. And not only they were born there, but the families spent some significant time of several generations in this area. So they originally come from this geographical region. Their social position is a bit different because Leland Bloom's father is described as a poor craftsman, but also he has the rabbinical ancestry, and he represented himself and he imagined himself as the Ben Tovim, so as kind of significant person with the rabbinical roots. The father of Haderet was also poor, but he was a rabbi. But the poverty was unfortunately quite common feature of the life of the rabbis in the Russian Empire at that moment. Both of them experienced the death of the mothers, and both mothers died of cholera, and both fathers remarried later, so both of them had stepmothers. Both families had quite traditional ambitions of their sons, and they wanted them to become rabbis and to be great in the Torah. Both authors were married rather young, and as we see from the information about their marriage, marriage conditions, probably their social position was still somehow similar and not that different, because the dowries and the castes were approximately the same. So as we see here, it's basically maybe not identical, but very similar childhoods. And we would probably expect that from this childhood, two quite similar people would evolve. But it wasn't so. It wasn't so at all. I just forgot. I wanted to show you that geographically they come from the same region, because Autobiographies was born here in Pinkham. Then he traveled with his family to this place, to Shillel. Then his father moved to Rogali, and he himself moved to Ponevezh to get married. And Lillian Bloom was born in Keidani and traveled later to Vilkomer to get married to a local girl. So here are the, we saw the similarities, but actually these two persons were very different in their adult life. And as all of you know, Leland Bloom was the profound Maskilic writer, and even the icon of the anti-traditional movement. And he suggested many reforms to be done to Judaism. And later he became a Palestinophile, which was also very modernist ideology. Rabinovich Teumim was, on the contrary, he was a rabbi. He was an Orthodox leader, and later he became at Rosh Yeshivat Mir. And later on, in his late years, he became a chief rabbi of Ashkenazi Prussian community in Jerusalem. So it's very different life trajectories, and also their autobiographical writing was very different. because Leland Bloom began to write rather early, in his late 20s, early 30s, and his autobiography was published already at 1876 when he was aged 33. And very soon it became a bestseller, the iconic book, which influenced a lot of people who later wrote their autobiographies. And it covers the span of 30 years, of first 30 years of his life. Rabinovich Teomim Ha'aderet began to write his autobiography quite late. Apparently he kept notes or some kind of the diary, but still the autobiography as the whole product, the whole work, was combined in his late years. And it was published after his death much later in 1983. And we even don't know if he intended it to be published or it was just kind of manuscript intended for his self-reflection or for his children and grandchildren to understand his life. And also the lifespan of the autobiography of Ha'aderet is much bigger because he covers like his almost his whole life. So these two autobiographies I've chosen to look at are very different in the conditions of autobiographical writing. And we would also expect that these conditions would influence the childhood narrative, which would be quite logical because if the person writes the account of his life in the age of 30, and if the person writes the account of his life in the age of 60, it probably would be two different accounts. But surprisingly, when we speak about childhood, their accounts are very similar. I'd even say surprisingly similar. Yeah, let's start with the size, the most objective characteristic of the autobiography or of the certain period described in the autobiography. Both authors describe their childhood in a rather short manner. So Leland Bloom devotes only 15 pages to his first 15 years of life, and in comparison to much more pages devoted to the next 15 years. Rabinovich Teomim makes it a bit longer, but still it's not the hundreds of pages which we may find by other authors. Secondly, both of them describe very similar topics. Both of them focus on education and the religious life, and later on their engagement and their marriage. In both autobiographies, the main character, the main figure is the father of the author. Mother is almost absent in both accounts, which may be understandable for Ha'aderet because his mother died when he was aged 5. But Leland Bloom's mother died when he was aged 10, so probably he remembered something of her, but chose not to describe these memories. Other family members are mentioned, but very en passant, and both of them don't add any emotional content to the descriptions. Father figure in both autobiographies, it's a loving and a caring person who does a lot for the child, for the benefit of the child, but in both cases, it's a very distant person. And we see in both autobiographies, we see almost no direct communication between the father and the son. And so, as I mentioned, we have the main topics discussed were education and later engagement and marriage. And the topics that are absent from the autobiography is mostly emotional involvement in the family relations and the account of the everyday activities of the everyday life. And finally, the last characteristic I'd like to point out here is the image of the author as a child. Interestingly, both of the authors depict themselves in childhood in very adult-like manner. And they somehow portray themselves as small adults and not as children. And one obviously would expect to see the differences inspired by the adult ideologies in these autobiographies. And we indeed see these differences, but they are not so major as we would expect them to be, because basically they present mostly in the childhood account. They present mostly in the evaluation of the events and the actions, but not in the way how the event was described, how it was organized, who were the main actors, and so on. So, for example, if we go back to the last example I gave about the image of the author as a child, we see that, for example, Lillenblum was quite angry with his family and his environment for not letting him to experience the actual childhood, for not letting him to behave like the boy, like a small boy. And he feels angry about that, and he feels critical about the society, which didn't let him experience that. While Haderet, yeah, he writes the same content, but he feels quite okay with that. Maybe he even feels that it's a desired feature for the child. So we see here the difference of the ideologies, but the very event, fact, feature of the childhood is basically the same. The next question, which logically arises here, is why these accounts are so similar? And my answer is that both authors were raised in the very similar traditional environment. And they went through the same stages in the childhood. So they basically experienced very similar childhood. And despite the fact that they evolved in the very different adults, they imbibed certain discourse of childhood as children. And it's not only the discourse of childhood, it's a certain type of experience and a certain type of behavior inspired by this discourse. And basically they could do nothing except reproducing this discourse, because it's the only experience of childhood they had. And even Lillenblum, who was quite unsatisfied with this experience and who criticizes a lot, he can't get out of it. He can't get rid of it. He's still inside of this experience, which basically shaped his mind. And I'd like to point out that it's not only these two authors who produced such similar account of childhood. Since I deal a lot with the childhood narratives in the autobiographies, I can say that when you read a lot of them, you begin to distinguish between two main types. So at least when we speak about the Jewish autobiographies written by Jews who came from Eastern Europe and describe the 19th or early 20th century. The narrative I've pointed out, the narrative by Lillenblum and Rabinovich Teumim, I call it the pre-modern narrative. And there is also another type, I call it modern narrative, which is much more emotional and much more focused on the everyday life and the everyday activities with parents, and is also characterized with much closer relations with parents. So basically we have the group, the big two groups of people who had very different childhoods and who reflected them in their autobiographical writing. And and here I'd like to proceed to conclusions and to state once more that in my example, we have two people with very similar actual childhoods, but very different views as adults, even opposite views as adults, because they were basically, if not enemies, but they were obviously not satisfied with each other's views. They still produce very similar childhood narrative, even despite the difference in the conditions of autobiographical writing. And the general typology of the narrative also remains the same by both of them. And we can still notice the influence of the adult beliefs, but mostly in the evaluation of the described events, which bring us to the conclusion that in the case of the Eastern Europe, or more precisely Russian Empire, and the description of childhood in the 19th and early 20th century, this description is shaped more by the actual childhood experience rather than by adult ideology. And thank you so much for your attention.